The LinkedIn message I wasn't supposed to see. I have a rule about reading work emails after 8 o'clock at night. 9 years as a cardiothoracic surgeon will teach you that if you don't build walls around the hours that belong to you, the hospital will take all of them. You will look up one day and discover that you have given your entire life to a building and have nothing left over for the one you actually live in. So I had the rule. Phone down at 8. Laptop closed. Whatever was waiting in the inbox at 9 p.m. would still be waiting at 6 a.m., and the world would continue rotating on its axis in the interim. I had that rule on the night everything changed, and I broke it for the most ordinary reason in the world. I was expecting a message from the chief of surgery about a scheduling conflict, something I needed to see before morning rounds, and I picked up my phone at 9:47 on a Tuesday in March to check whether it had come in. It hadn't. But something else had. A LinkedIn notification, which I hadn't turned off because I never checked LinkedIn at home and had never considered that I'd need to. The notification was a connection request, which meant nothing. I get those constantly, residents, med students, industry reps. I was about to set the phone back down. And then I read the name on the connection request. Dominic Hale. I want to stop here and explain why that name meant something, because without the context, it's just a name. Dominic Hale was my husband's college roommate. His closest friend for the 2 years they'd shared an apartment at Georgia Tech before Dominic graduated and moved to Dallas for a job that turned into a career that, by all accounts, turned into a very successful life in commercial real estate. Marcus had mentioned him periodically over the years, the way you mention people from a chapter of your life that has been affectionately closed with warmth, with the past tense, with the particular nostalgia of a friendship that had been real and was now mostly preserved in memory. They were not in active contact. That was what Marcus had told me. When I'd asked, maybe 2 years into our marriage, whether he kept up with Dominic, he'd said they texted occasionally, birthdays, big life stuff, but that they'd grown in different directions. Different cities, different schedules. The natural drift of adult friendships. So why was Dominic Hale sending me a LinkedIn connection request at 9:47 on a Tuesday night? I accepted it. Then I sat there for a moment. And then, because I am a person who is trained to follow a symptom to its source rather than stop at the surface presentation, I opened Dominic's profile. There was nothing unusual about the profile itself. 14 years in commercial real estate. Dallas, Texas. Headshot of a man I vaguely recognized from an old photo I'd seen once of Marcus's college years, a group shot at some campus event, Marcus in the middle, grinning, younger than I'd ever known him. I was about to close the app when I noticed, in the activity section of the profile, a photo Dominic had been tagged in 4 weeks earlier. I pressed on it. It was a photo from a restaurant. 5 men at a long table, the kind of group dinner that happens at conferences or work events, nice place, good lighting, everyone looking at the camera with the easy energy of men who have been drinking well for a couple of hours. Marcus was at the end of the table. I looked at that photograph for a long time. I looked at the location tag on the photo, Austin, Texas. I looked at the date, February 14th. February 14th. Valentine's Day. Marcus had been in Baltimore on February 14th. A cardiology conference, not my specialty, but his GP had been sending him to this particular one for years for continuing education credits. He'd left on the 13th, a Thursday, flown out early, texted me from the airport with a photo of his overpriced airport sandwich and the caption, "Medicine is paying for this. Don't tell the insurance board." I had laughed. I had sent back a heart emoji. He had come back on the 15th, Valentine's Day +1, with flowers he'd picked up at the airport and a reservation at the Italian place on Peachtree where we'd had our first date. I had eaten that dinner across from my husband, and he had looked me in the eye for 2 hours, and he had been in Austin, Texas on February 14th, at a dinner with his college roommate who was now sending me LinkedIn requests in the middle of a Tuesday night. My name is Nadia. I am 41 years old. I have been a cardiothoracic surgeon for 9 years and a wife for 7. And I have spent the better part of my adult life in high-stakes rooms making high-stakes decisions with the kind of clarity that does not come naturally to most people, but that I have built through years of deliberate and exhausting practice. I set my phone down on the kitchen counter very carefully, The way I set down instruments in the oar. With control. With intention. With the understanding that precision matters most when everything in you wants to move fast. And then I went to find my husband. He was in the living room watching something on television, a documentary about Formula One racing that he'd been working through for the past 3 weeks. Our dog, a French bulldog named Otis, who believed the couch belonged to him and that Marcus and I were merely permitted guests, was wedged between Marcus's left hip and the armrest, with the commitment of a dog who has made a decision and will not be revisited. I stood in the doorway. Marcus looked up. He said, "Hey, watch with me. They just got to the Monaco episode." I said, "Who is Dominic Hale?" Not a question. A statement. I'd learned a long time ago that questions give people a place to hide. You ask someone a question, and they answer the question you asked, not the one you needed answered. Statements leave less room. Marcus looked at me. His expression did not change immediately, which was a data point in itself. A man with nothing to hide hears his old college roommate's name from his wife and looks confused. He does not take a fraction of a second to calculate. He said, "You know who Dominic is." "My roommate from tech." I said, "He sent me a LinkedIn request tonight." Another fraction of a second. He said, "That's weird." "I don't know why he'd do that." I said, "I saw the photo, Marcus." The room changed. I have been in rooms when they change operating rooms when a situation shifts, emergency rooms when the numbers on the monitor stop trending in a survivable direction. I know what the air does when something pivots from one state to another. The living room did that. Otis looked up from his position on the couch with the vague concern of an animal who has registered an atmospheric shift and is deciding whether it requires his physical intervention. Marcus said, "What photo?" I said, "Austin. February 14th. You were in Baltimore." He looked at the television, then at his hands, then at me. The sequence lasted about 4 seconds and contained, I would later think, the entire interior process of a man deciding whether to attempt a defense and concluding that the geometry of it didn't work. He said, "Nadia." I said, "Don't say my name like that. Tell me what was in Austin." He didn't answer immediately. I walked into the living room, and I sat down in the chair across from the couch, not next to him. I looked at him with the same expression I use when I'm waiting for a resident to tell me they don't understand something, patient, still, completely without mercy in its expectation of honesty. He told me. And what he told me was not what I was expecting, which I say not to diminish it, but because I think it matters that betrayal is rarely the shape you have practiced for. I had been bracing in those 30 seconds between the doorway and the chair for a woman's name. For the particular architecture of infidelity, I had some template for, some map, some prior information about how it presented and where it led. Marcus told me he had not attended the cardiology conference in Baltimore in February. He had not been in Baltimore at all. He had been, for the past 19 months, flying to Austin every 6 to 8 weeks to meet with a group of investors in a commercial real estate venture that he had entered into without telling me. That had consumed $312,000 of our joint savings, and that was, by February of this year, in serious financial and legal trouble. He said, "I was going to tell you when I had it figured out." He said, "I didn't want you to worry." He said, "I know what it looks like. I know how long this has been going on. I need you to understand that there was never anyone else. This was only ever about money and my own stupidity, and I was terrified of you finding out." I sat in that chair across from my husband, looked at him, and felt something I have been trying to find the right word for ever since. Not relief, because $312,000 of our savings and 19 months of a secret life were not relieving. Not betrayal in the form I'd prepared for, but betrayal in a form I hadn't, which turns out to be its own specific damage. Something close to the feeling of bracing for an impact and having it arrive at an angle you didn't expect. The protection you built is in the wrong place, and you absorb the hit directly. I said, "How much is left?" He said, 11,000, approximately. In that account. I said, "Tell me about the legal trouble." He was a high school history teacher, my husband. Not a financier. Not a real estate developer. A 39-year-old man who loved his students and coached JV basketball and made the best brisket in our neighborhood and had, apparently, been conducting a parallel financial life for 19 months with people I had never heard of. In a city I had no reason to know he'd been going to, on money we had both built. He told me about it for 2 hours. It started, he said, with Dominic. A conversation at a birthday party for a mutual friend in Savannah, 2 years back, at which Dominic had talked about a commercial real estate deal he was involved in outside Austin, a mixed-use development with unusual return projections. A small syndicate of investors, room for a few more if you moved quickly. He said Marcus had listened and had thought about the money we'd been making and sitting on, about the fact that I earned what I earned. He earned what he earned, and we were comfortable, but he'd been carrying for years a quiet feeling that our financial future was more mine than ours, and that this felt like a way to change that. He said he'd wanted to come to me with success. Not with a proposal. With a result. He wanted to have done something, built something, contributed something that arrived already finished and already good. He wanted to put something in front of me and say, I did this. I built this for us. He said he now understood that this logic had been a symptom of something he should have brought into a conversation rather than a project. I listened to all of it. I asked the questions a person trained in diagnostic reasoning asks when they are trying to understand a complete picture rather than confirm a hypothesis they already have. I asked about the other investors, the structure of the deal, the specific nature of the legal trouble, whether it was civil, regulatory, or something further along that spectrum. I asked what he needed from me next. He said, I need your help. I don't know how to get out of this without you. I said, you should have said that 19 months ago. He said, I know. I said, I'm going to need you to sleep in the guest room tonight. He said, okay. I said, not because I'm deciding for us. Because I need to think, and I can't think with you next to me right now. He took Otis with him, which I hadn't expected, and which I was grateful for because I needed the bedroom to myself and also because the sight of Otis trotting faithfully after Marcus down the hall, completely unaware of what had just shifted in the household, was one of the saddest small things I had ever seen. I did not have room for it in that moment. I sat in bed in the dark for 3 hours. I want to explain something about the specific nature of what Marcus had done versus what I had prepared myself to find. I think there is a tendency, when a story like this doesn't involve another person, to hear it as a lesser betrayal. Financial infidelity is the term some therapists use, and I want to tell you that the word infidelity is exactly right, because what it shares with the romantic version, the one I'd been bracing for, is not the content but the architecture. The decision to build something secret. The construction of a parallel reality inside the shared one. The ongoing daily performance of a life that is not the life you are actually living. The $312,000 was not the injury. The 19 months of practice deception were the injury. The Valentine's Day dinner with the flowers from the airport, looking me in my eyes for 2 hours after lying to me for a year and a half, that was the injury. I am a cardiothoracic surgeon. I spend my professional life literally inside the chambers of the human heart. I understand, in a way that is more than metaphorical, how the thing works. How the valves open and close in sequence, the precise timing required, and the catastrophic consequences of a single valve that is not doing what it is supposed to do, even when everything around it looks normal from the outside. I thought about that while I lay in the dark. The valve that had been quietly failing while the rest of us kept circulating. My mother called at 7 the next morning, which was not unusual. She called most mornings, a habit from when I was a resident, and she worried about whether I was sleeping. I let it go to voicemail. I lay there listening to her voice, leaving a message about nothing important, a recipe she'd made last night, something she'd seen on television, and I felt the specific grief of normal life continuing to run on its rails while yours has gone off them. I got up. I went to my closet. I got dressed for the hospital in the automatic way you do when your body has been going to the same place for the same reason long enough that it no longer requires conscious direction. Marcus was in the kitchen when I came down. He'd made coffee mine the way I take it, which he has known for 7 years. He'd fed Otis. He looked like a man who had not slept, which was accurate, and which I registered without it softening anything. He said, I have the name of a lawyer. for the investment situation. I'm calling today. I said, good. I picked up my coffee. I said, I need you to send me everything. All of it. The contracts, the correspondence, the account statements. Everything you have. I'm not going to manage this for you. But I am not going to be in a position again of not knowing the full picture. He said, I'll send it by tonight. I said, Marcus. I waited until he looked at me. I don't know what this is yet. I don't know if we're going to be okay. I am not in a position to tell you that right now. What I can tell you is that I am going to do surgery today, and I am going to be excellent at it, and tonight when I come home, I am going to read everything you send me, and then we are going to make some decisions about what happens next. That is what I can offer you today. He said, that's enough. That's more than I deserve right now. I left. I drove to the hospital in the specific suspended state that had settled over me since 9:47 the previous night, a peculiar clarity, high resolution, and cold. The kind my body produces when it has correctly identified a high-stakes situation and redirected all available resources toward function. I did 4 surgeries that day. I was, as I told him I would be, excellent. My closest friend on the cardiology floor was a woman named Dr. Priya Suresh, an interventional cardiologist with 7 years at the hospital, the kind of friend who had been built by the specific intensity of medicine, forged in night shifts and bad outcomes, and the particular intimacy of knowing each other in extremis. We had lunch together most Wednesdays, a standing appointment we'd maintained for 3 years. This was a Wednesday. We sat in the physician's lounge with bad cafeteria salads, and she said, within 90 seconds of sitting down, what happened? I said, what do you mean? She said, Nadia, I've operated next to you for 7 years. You're doing the thing you do when you're holding something. What happened? I told her. Not all of it, but enough. The LinkedIn notification, the photograph, the Austin trips, the money, the 2-hour conversation in the living room while Otis observed from the couch with diplomatic neutrality. Priya listened. She did not interrupt. She did not make the face some people make when they're about to give you their opinion before you've finished presenting the facts. She just received it. When I finished, she said, how are you right now in this moment? I said, I'm functioning. She said, that's not what I asked. I thought about it. I said, I'm somewhere between devastated and furious and also strangely calm, and I don't trust the calm because I know it's the shock doing its job and the devastation is waiting behind it, and I don't know when it's going to arrive. She nodded. She said, when it arrives, call me. I don't care what time it is. I said, Priya. She said, I know. I mean it. Call me. The devastation arrived on Friday night. I had spent Wednesday evening and Thursday going through everything Marcus sent me. He had sent everything, I'll say that for him, hadn't filtered or curated. Had sent me the complete record of 19 months of financial decisions made by a man who had been in over his head since approximately month 4, and had spent the subsequent 15 months trying to find his way back to the surface without admitting he was drowning. The investment was in a commercial development syndicate that, due to a combination of mismanagement by the lead developer and a regulatory issue with the land title that surfaced in November, had become the subject of a civil action involving 4 of the 7 investors. The $312,000 was largely unrecoverable in the short term, possibly in any term. I would need a lawyer's assessment, and I had already called a partner at a firm I'd consulted with once before on a contract matter. Financially, we could absorb it. That is a sentence I say with full awareness of what it means and does not mean. We had savings beyond what he'd accessed, and I made what I made, and the loss was devastating, but not structurally fatal to our material life. This fact was both true and entirely beside the point. Money replaced is not trust replaced. The math of recovery is irrelevant to whether you will be okay. On Friday night, I sent my last email at 7:30, came home to a house that smelled like the dinner Marcus had made, sat down at the kitchen table, and looked at the food he'd put together with the particular care of a man trying to communicate something he doesn't have better language for yet, and I fell completely apart. Not loudly. I don't do loud. I sat at the kitchen table and cried with the controlled, exhausted thoroughness of someone who has been managing for 3 days and has finally reached the end of management. Otis came and put his chin on my knee, which is his signature move for grief, and I put my hand on his head, and we sat like that for a while. Marcus came into the kitchen from wherever he'd been. He saw me. He sat down in the chair beside me, not touching me, not talking, just being present with the distance I still needed between us. After a while, I said, "The part one keep coming back to is Valentine's Day." He said, "I know." I said, "You came home with flowers. From the airport. You had been in Austin. And you sat across from me at dinner, and you let me believe that the whole day had been what you told me it was. And you knew. You were inside the lie the entire time, and you let it run." He said, "Yes." I said, "That's the thing I don't know how to get past. Not the money. The money is a problem with a solution. The person sitting across from me at dinner, I don't know what to do with that. He didn't offer me anything easy. I want to give him that. He didn't say it would never happen again, that he'd been a different person then, or any of the things that would have made me get up from the table and leave for a hotel. He sat with the weight of it in the room between us, and he said, "I don't know how to give you that back. I don't know how to undo that dinner. I can only tell you that I was terrified and stupid, and I chose the choice that felt survivable in the moment without thinking about what it cost in every other direction, and I am going to be answering for that for a long time, and I know it." I wiped my face. I ate some of the dinner he'd made. It was good. It was always good. Marcus could cook the way some people do naturally, with ease and instinct, and I had loved that about him for 7 years, and the love had not gone anywhere, which was its own complicated thing to sit with. I called Priya after dinner. She talked me through it for an hour and a half, sitting in her own kitchen 2 miles away in Midtown, her husband occasionally passing through the background. Her voice steady and real and free of the particular anxiety that sometimes comes when you're the friend of someone in crisis. You're so worried about them that your worry becomes a burden in itself. At the end, she said, "What does your gut tell you about him?" I said, "My gut tells me he is not a man who set out to deceive me. He is a man who made a decision from fear and then couldn't find the door back from it and kept building the room instead." She said, "Do you believe that?" I said, "I believe the money story. I believe there is no other person. I believe he did this specific terrible thing for the reason he said he did it." I paused. "I don't know yet if believing all of that is enough to rebuild on." She said, "That's an honest place to be." I said, "It doesn't feel like enough of an answer." She said, "It's the right answer for where you are. You don't need the whole answer tonight." The next 3 weeks were strange. In the in-between weeks, when our life had the external shape of the life it had always been, I went to the hospital. He went to school. Otis maintained his sovereignty over the couch. And we ate dinner together most nights, because neither of us knew what not eating dinner together would signal. Neither of us was ready to signal it. But underneath the shape, everything had the quality of a structure whose load-bearing walls are being assessed every interaction, carrying the question of whether the thing could hold. I hired the attorney. We had 2 meetings about the investment situation and the civil action, and what emerged was a messy but navigable picture. There would be a loss, a process, documentation, negotiations, and probably 18 months of administrative complexity before the thing was fully resolved. None of it was criminal. All of it was recoverable, in the material sense. I handled those meetings mostly myself because I needed to be the one holding the information rather than having it held for me, and Marcus understood that and let me. He had started therapy the week after I found out. Not because I asked him to. Because he called someone and made an appointment and told me at dinner one night, without fanfare, that he'd started seeing a therapist and that he thought it was something he should have done years before this, and that he was going to continue regardless of what we decided about us. That mattered to me. Not because therapy is magic or because the act of starting it was a debt paid. It mattered because it was the first evidence of him turning toward something instead of away. His entire history with the investment had been a turning away from the problem, from me, from the honest version of what was happening. The therapy was a small but concrete turning toward, and I was someone who needed to see what turning toward looked like from him before I could assess anything. My own therapist was a woman I'd been seeing occasionally for 2 years for the particular variety of burnout that high-performing surgeons are required to pretend they don't experience. Her name was Dr. Camilla Osei. Her office was in Buckhead. When I arrived for an unscheduled session the week after everything came out and told her what had happened, she said, "Tell me the whole thing from the beginning." I did, and when I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, then said the thing I most needed to hear. She said, "I want you to notice that your first instinct when you saw that photograph was not to put the phone down. Your first instinct was to follow it." I said, "Yes." She said, "That is your relationship to truth. That is who you are. And I want you to know that what you're navigating right now is not a question of whether you're strong enough, smart enough, or emotionally capable enough to handle this. You have already demonstrated all of that. The question is what you want to build next, and that is a different question entirely, and you don't have to answer it until you're ready." I sat with that for a long time after the session, the question of what I wanted to build next. I had built things my whole life. My career had been an 18-year construction project undertaken with the specific, sustained intention of someone who decided at 22 what they were going to become, and then became it through the kind of daily, grinding, unglamorous effort that medical training requires, and that very few people who haven't been through it can fully appreciate. I had built my life in Atlanta with the same intentionality. The apartment, then the house, the marriage, the rhythms and structures of a life that looked and felt like the one I had designed. And now I was standing in the architectural equivalent of discovering that the contractor had made decisions without telling me, had substituted materials that had compromised a section of the structure. I was the one deciding whether to repair it or start over. I am better at repair than I am given credit for. That is literally the skill I have spent 9 years developing. The ability to find the damage, understand its nature and extent, and close it in a way that leaves the structure functional. I know how to repair things. The question was whether I wanted to repair this one. It came into focus for me on a Sunday morning about a month after the LinkedIn notification. Not in a dramatic way. In the quiet way that important realizations seem to arrive when you have finally been still long enough to receive them. I was in the backyard with Otis, early, before Marcus was up, in the specific pale light of a Sunday morning in Atlanta, when the city is briefly, genuinely quiet. Otis was doing his forensic investigation of the perimeter, applying the full weight of his considerable professional focus to a section of the fence that had apparently yielded new intelligence overnight. I had my coffee. I was not thinking about anything in particular. And I found myself thinking about the version of Marcus I'd married and the version of Marcus I now knew, and about whether those were two different men or one man in fuller resolution. I realized that the fuller resolution was the honest answer. He was not a man who had been pretending to be someone he wasn't for 7 years. He was a man who was genuinely who I thought he was in all the ways that had mattered, who also contained a fear he had never shown me, a specific and deep insecurity about his worth in the architecture of our life. That fear had driven a terrible set of choices that had compounded until they became this. I didn't excuse it. I want to be precise about that. Understanding is not excusing. Cause is not absolution. He had made choices, had made them continuously over 19 months, had had an uncountable number of moments in which he could have stopped and turned toward me instead of continuing to turn away. Every one of those moments was a choice, and every one of them was his. But I was also able, standing in my backyard with my coffee and my dog on a Sunday morning, to see him fully. Not the version of him I'd been protecting in my mind during the in-between weeks, reduced to the worst thing he'd done, and not the cleaned-up version he'd presented for 7 years. The full version. The man who coached teenagers through history with a patience I'd always admired and a genuine love for the work that had never been performed. The man who'd sat next to me through 2 deaths in my family with a steadiness I had needed desperately and never had to ask for. The man who had, from a fear he should have brought to me but didn't, tried to build something he could put in my hands and say, "I did this for us." The man who was wrong in a way that cost both of us. And the man who, when it came out, had not lied further, had not minimized, had not reached for an explanation that protected his image at the expense of my understanding, had sent me everything, made the appointment, stopped building the room, and finally opened the door. I went back inside. He was up by then, in the kitchen, with Otis's breakfast being prepared, to the ceremony Otis expected and received. Marcus was in his Saturday sweatshirt and his glasses, which I'd always liked on him. I'd told him once they made him look like a professor, and he'd said he was a teacher, not a professor, and I'd said the same energy, and he'd pretended to be offended. I sat down at the kitchen table. I said, I want to go to couples therapy. Let's find someone and go together. He turned around. He looked at me with an expression I recognized from the restaurant in Inman Park on our first date, the expression of someone paying full attention, all the way in, not rationing. He said, yes. Tell me who and when, and I'll be there. I said, and I need you to understand that I'm not going in to decide whether to stay. I've made that decision. I'm staying. I'm going in to build the version of this marriage that should have existed from the beginning. The one where you tell me the actual thing instead of the version you think I can handle. He said, I understand. I said, I can handle the actual thing, Marcus. I need you to know that in your bones. I am not a woman who needs to be protected from the truth about our lives. I am a woman who needs the truth about our lives. That's what I'm asking for. He said, I know. I knew that when I married you. I made myself forget it because forgetting it was easier than being afraid in front of you. I said, you can be afraid in front of me. He said, I'm learning that. Otis, having consumed his breakfast with the focused efficiency of an athlete in season, trotted over and positioned himself under the table directly between our feet, which is where he went when he determined that a situation required his physical presence. We found a therapist named Dr. Jerome Washington, based in Virginia Highland, who specialized in trust repair in marriages, his phrase, which I found exactly right in its specificity, trust repair, not relationship counseling, not marriage enrichment, but the specific project of repairing a broken thing with the seriousness that project required. The first session was the hardest thing I'd done outside of an operating room. Not because Dr. Washington pushed too hard, but because sitting in a room with your husband and an objective third party and being asked to articulate the specific nature of your damage required a kind of exposure I was not accustomed to. I was accustomed to being the person in the room who assessed damage. Being the one whose damage was being assessed was a different position entirely. Marcus was honest in ways that cost him. He talked about the fear I'd already heard about the worth question, the contribution question, the quiet years of measuring himself against my career, and coming up with an answer he didn't like. Dr. Washington didn't let him stop there. He asked Marcus to trace the fear further back, before me, before us, and what Marcus found, slowly, over several sessions, was a story from his family of origin that had nothing to do with me, but had been running alongside our marriage for 7 years. Informing decisions I hadn't been allowed to understand because I hadn't been given the data. His father had lost a business when Marcus was 12. A building supply company that his father had spent 10 years growing and that had failed in a single bad year. The family had survived it materially eventually, but the silence around it had been total. His father had never spoken about it. Had rebuilt, had moved on, had presented the recovery as the story rather than the loss. Had passed on to Marcus, through that silence, the lesson that failure is something you manage alone and present is handled. That the people you love should receive results, not process. That asking for help is the same thing as admitting that you are not enough. Marcus had not known that was the lesson until he heard himself describing the Austin trips in that room. I watched him figure it out in real time. I watched the specific expression of a person seeing the architecture of their own patterns for the first time, the particular combination of recognition and grief that arrives when you understand not just what you did but why, and how long the why has been running, and how much it has cost. I didn't feel sorry for him in a way that erased anything, but I felt something. The particular tenderness of recognizing a person's wound and understanding that it predated you and that it shaped them in ways that damaged you, and that both of those things are true simultaneously. Dr. Washington said, "In our 4th session, Nadia, I want to ask you something directly. In the year and a half that this was happening in the day-to-day of your marriage, were there moments where something felt off and you didn't follow it?" I thought about that honestly. I said, there were moments. Small things. He seemed distracted sometimes in a way I attributed to work. There was a period in the fall when he was on his phone more than usual, and I noticed, but didn't inquire. Dr. Washington said, "What stopped you from inquiring?" I said, "A combination of things." I was deep in a particularly demanding stretch at the hospital, and I think I trusted him completely. I mean that in the genuine sense. I had no reason to doubt anything, and so I didn't bring the focused attention I might have brought if something had already flagged. He said, "How do you feel about that now?" I said, "I feel that I'm not responsible for his choices." That's clear to me. But I also recognized that I had set the bar for conversation in our marriage quite high without meaning to. That by being someone who brought only the fully formed thing to the table personally, I had perhaps signaled without intending to that only the fully formed thing was welcome. That the halfway thing, the I'm afraid thing, the I'm in over my head, and I don't know what to do thing, had nowhere obvious to land. Marcus was very still across from me when I said that. Dr. Washington said, "Is that an explanation or an accountability?" I said, "It's an observation about the system. The accountability for the choices inside the system belongs to him. But systems are built by both people, and I am not going to exit this process without understanding what I built." That was the session I think about most. The one where I stopped thinking about this only as something that had happened to me and started thinking about it as something that had happened inside, something we had both built. That distinction does not redistribute the fault. He made the choices. The choices were his. But a marriage is an ecology, not a single organism, and if you want to build a better one, you have to understand the whole ecosystem, not just the part that caught fire. 6 months after the LinkedIn notification, Marcus and I were still in our house in Buckhead, still in therapy with Dr. Washington, still in the slow, non-linear work of building the thing we should have built the first time. The legal situation with the investment had been largely resolved through a negotiated settlement. The financial damage was substantially what we'd projected, and the administrative complexity was being unwound in the background by the attorney. At the same time, we focused on the things that couldn't be delegated. I will not tell you it was easy. I will not construct for you a version of this where the love was enough to smooth over the specific injury of 19 months of a parallel life. Love was necessary, but not sufficient. What was sufficient was the combination of love and work and the daily decision, made without fanfare in ordinary moments, to keep turning toward instead of away. There was a night in August, 6 months in, when we were sitting on the back porch we'd always meant to use more, and had finally started actually using, a deliberate reclamation of a space that had been available to us and wasted. Otis was doing his evening patrol. The Atlanta summer was at its peak, warm and humid and insect loud, the sky doing the thing it does in August where the last light stays longer than seems fair. Marcus said, out of a silence that had been the comfortable kind, "I've been thinking about what you said in that session. About signaling that only the finished thing was welcome." I said, "What about it?" He said, "I want to say clearly, for the record, that was on me. I'm not going to let that observation become a thing you carry. I knew who you were. I knew your standards were high because you held yourself to them. I could have asked for an exception. I could have told you I had a half-formed thing that was scaring me. I chose not to because I was ashamed and I was afraid. That's not an environment you built. That was a wall I built inside it." I looked at him. The man who coached JV basketball, made brisket, and wore glasses that made him look like a professor. I said, "Thank you for saying that." He said, "Thank you for still being here." I thought about the LinkedIn notification. 9:47 on a Tuesday in March. The connection request was from a name I recognized. The photograph in Austin. The understanding that the floor had opened under the life I thought I was living, and that what was underneath was nothing, was not empty, was messy and frightening and dishonest, and also, underneath all of that, was a man who had been trying to love me in a way that his own damage had warped into something I almost didn't survive. I thought about what Dr. Camilla had said, and about the question of what I wanted to build next. I thought, I am building it. Right here. On this porch. With this man and this dog and this new, harder, and more honest version of the thing we started 7 years ago. I am building it with my eyes open this time, with the full picture on the table, with the agreement between us that the half-formed thing and the afraid thing and the I don't know thing all have a place in the room. It is not the marriage I thought I had. It is, I believe, the marriage I actually want. Those turned out to be different, and the gap between them cost us both something real. but I am here and he is here and we are building. I want to say one more thing before I finish, because I think it is the most important thing I've learned through this entire experience, and I have thought carefully about how to say it. I am a surgeon. My job is to see clearly and act decisively and not let what I want to be true interfere with what is true. I have trained that capacity for 18 years. I applied it to every aspect of my professional life with consistency and discipline. And I had not applied it fully to my marriage. Not because I was weak or foolish, I was neither. But because the intimacy of a marriage creates a specific kind of trust that, at its best, frees you from constant vigilance and, at its worst, allows you to stop seeing clearly because seeing clearly feels like a betrayal of the trust itself. I had confused vigilance with suspicion. I had thought that asking the half-formed question, following the small inconsistency, bringing the barely there feeling into the light, was paranoia. That it was a failure of faith in my husband. And in refusing to do those things, I had given the secret more room than it needed. The version of trust one want now is not the version that asks you to stop seeing. It is the version that asks you to see everything and bring it into the conversation. The version where nothing is too small to name, where the fear and the question and the not quite right feeling all have a home, where the intimacy of the marriage is strong enough to hold the difficult thing without breaking. That is what I am building. That is what we are building. Otis has come back from his patrol and positioned himself across both our feet simultaneously, a feat of French bulldog geometric confidence that I have come to think of as his endorsement of the evening. Marcus is looking at the last of the light over the roofline of the house next door. I am here. We are here. The porch we never used enough is getting used. The end.